Hey, welcome. Have you ever stopped to think about what actually powers our planet? I mean, really powers it. It's not just one thing. It's this huge, interconnected, and mostly invisible living engine. Today, we're going to pop the hood on that engine and see exactly what makes it run. And our whole journey starts with a pretty simple question.
So, what could a massive, sprawling forest possibly have in common with a tiny, quiet little pond? I mean, on the surface, they seem like completely different worlds, right? But believe it or not, they are both running on the exact same fundamental operating system. And if you can understand that system, you can understand pretty much all life on Earth.
The answer, of course, is that they're both ecosystems. And that's just a way of saying it's a functional unit of nature. It's any place, really, where living things, the biotic parts, are interacting with each other and with their non-living or abiotic environment. It's an idea that's so elegant, it scales from the entire planet all the way down to a single drop of water.
Okay, so to see this engine up close, we're going to shrink our focus way down. Trying to analyze a whole forest at once can be, well, a little overwhelming. But a simple pond, it's the perfect self-contained little world. It has all the same core pieces and functions, just on a much more manageable scale. Think of any ecosystem like it has a cast of characters. It all starts with the stage itself. That's the abiotic, non-living stuff like water, soil, and sunlight. Then you've got your producers, like algae and plants, who literally create all the food from scratch. They get eaten by the consumers, like tiny zooplankton and insects. And then, when anyone dies, the decomposers, this absolutely crucial cleanup crew of fungi and bacteria, they step in to recycle every last bit.
So, we've got our players, but what makes them all work together? What's the script they're following? Well, the answer is energy. You can think of it like the currency of the ecosystem. It's what gets made, what gets spent, and what gets passed around. And it drives literally all the action. So let's follow the money. I mean, the energy.
You know, except for a few really weird exceptions in the super deep sea, the sun is the ultimate power source for everything on Earth. But most of us can't just go out and sunbathe for lunch, right? That energy isn't directly usable. That is where the producers come in. Through photosynthesis, they capture that sunlight and they turn it into chemical energy, biomass, actual organic stuff. We call this primary production.
But here's a really important distinction. Plants don't give away all the energy they create. Think of it like a paycheck. The gross primary productivity, or GPP, is the total amount of energy they capture. That's your gross pay. But they have to use some of that just to stay alive, to pay their own bills. That's respiration. What's left over is the net primary productivity, or NPP. That's the take-home pay, the profit that can actually be passed on to the rest of the ecosystem. So, how much net energy does this big living engine of our planet actually produce in a year? Well, it's an incredible 170 billion tons of organic matter, if you measure it in dry weight. That right there is the total energy budget that's available to sustain almost all life on Earth for an entire year.
But get this, because here's where it gets really surprising. You would think the oceans, right? They cover 70% of the planet. They must be the big powerhouses. Nope, not even close. Land-based ecosystems, which only cover about 30% of the surface, they're responsible for 115 billion tons of that total. That is more than double the productivity of the entire ocean. Wild.
Okay, so we've seen how energy is created by living things. But what happens when they die? Does all that stored up energy just disappear? No way. Instead, it becomes the fuel for a totally different, but just as important, pathway, the detritus food chain. Death isn't the end here. It's really just the beginning of the recycling process.
And this recycling process, decomposition, it's this amazing multi-step journey. It kicks off with bigger critters like earthworms breaking things down into smaller pieces. That's fragmentation. Then, this microscopic army of bacteria and fungi gets to work, chemically dismantling the material until it eventually becomes humus. You know, that super dark, rich stuff you find in healthy soil? And the final step, mineralization, releases those core inorganic nutrients, making them available for plants to use all over again. It is nature's perfect circular economy.
Now, these processes of creating and recycling energy, they're not random at all. They follow very strict rules. And those rules build a predictable structure that governs all of life. A structure that, as it turns out, looks a lot like a pyramid.
So we've kind of touched on these two energy paths. There's the grazing food chain, the GFC, which is the one we all learned about in school. A goat eats grass, a wolf feeds the goat, and so on. It starts with living plants. Then there's the detritus food chain, the DFC, which starts with dead stuff. And here's the key difference. In water, in aquatic systems, that grazing chain is the main event. But on land, a much, much bigger chunk of energy flows through the decomposers in the detritus chain.
So, to really understand this pyramid shape, we just need one quick concept, a trophic level. And don't worry, it sounds technical, but it's super simple. It's just an organism's position in the food chain. Producers, the ones making the food, they're on the first trophic level. Herbivores who eat them are on the second. Carnivores who eat the herbivores are on the third, and you get the idea.
Now, here is the absolute game changer, the most crucial point. Energy transfer between these levels is incredibly inefficient. It's governed by what we call the 10% rule. Basically, when an herbivore eats a plant, it only gets about 10% of that plant's stored energy. The other 90% is just lost, mostly as heat. And this rule applies every single time energy moves up a level.
So if you're losing 90% of your energy at every single step, how does that constant energy drain actually shape the entire structure of life?
Well, this massive energy loss creates what we call ecological pyramids. In most places, like a grassland, the pyramid of biomass is upright, just like you'd expect. You need a huge mass of grass at the bottom to support a smaller mass of gazelles, which supports an even smaller mass of lions. But in the ocean, we see this totally fascinating exception, an inverted pyramid. The total mass of consumers, like all the fish, can actually be greater at any given moment than the mass of their producers, the phytoplankton. And this is only possible because those little phytoplankton reproduce so incredibly fast that their tiny population can feed a huge one.
But while you can sometimes flip a pyramid of numbers or even biomass, there is one pyramid that is always, without a single exception, upright, and that is the pyramid of energy. Because of the second law of thermodynamics, energy is always lost as it flows from one level to the next. You can never, ever have more energy at a higher trophic level than at the one below it. It's just an unbreakable law of physics.
All right, so we've taken the living engine apart, we've looked at all the components, and we've figured out the rules of the road. But this isn't just some abstract biology lesson. Why does all of this fundamentally matter?
Well, the key thing to take away is this. Nature is built on these functional engines called ecosystems. Inside them, energy flows in one direction, from the sun down. That flow is governed by a strict 10% rule, which creates the pyramid structure that ultimately limits and defines all life as we know it.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. What's so fascinating is that a single species isn't always stuck on one trophic level. A sparrow, for example, is a primary consumer when it eats seeds, but it becomes a secondary consumer the moment it eats an insect. So think about your own day. When you eat a salad, you're a primary consumer. When you eat a piece of chicken, you're a secondary consumer. How many different trophic levels do you operate on? It's a pretty good reminder that we're not just outside observers of this living engine. We are a very active and pretty complex part of it ourselves.